US innovates, China copies, and the European Union? Well, the European Union regulates. It regulates things that are also not theirs. They're like the grumpy old man of the world, and there are few cases where this is as true as in artificial intelligence.
Parliament approves landmark law to regulate artificial intelligence.
Of course, this doesn't mean that Europe is the only power regulating AI. We don't have to look any further than Joe Biden, who's signed a very similar executive order. And China, well, what can I say? Everything related to national security is under the supervision of the Communist Party. Now, it's one thing to regulate, which is what the United States does, and quite another to create bureaucratic nightmares, which is what Europe does. But to help you understand why, let me ask you a question. What big companies do you know in the world of AI? Many of you will think ChatGPT from OpenAI, the AI of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, DeepMind, and even Nvidia participates in this system. And what do all these companies have in common? Not one of them is European. As you can see in this graph, the US has more notable machine learning models than all other countries combined. And if we were talking about AI-related patents per 100,000 inhabitants, the US has 4.23, only behind South Korea, while the top European country is Germany, with a ridiculous 0.66. And it's no longer just a question of results. If we're talking about pure and simple investment, the US multiplied by 50 the money invested by Europe, reaching $67 billion in 2023. Brussels is not only regulating what it does not have, but it is also unlikely to provide the right environment for these technologies to grow. So the questions are clear. Why has Europe fallen so far behind in a key sector like artificial intelligence? And perhaps most importantly, what can be done to remedy it? And if your iPhone hasn't just answered that question for you, I think I'll need the whole video to answer those questions for you. Artificial intelligence is a very complex topic, that much is clear. But broadly speaking, a good industry needs at least 3 key ingredients. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but of these 3 key factors, Europe loses out on absolutely all of them. But let's go through them one by one. As you can imagine, artificial intelligence is not powered by the brains of child prodigies. It is powered by electricity. It is estimated that it represents 2% of all electricity consumption globally, and by 2030, there are estimates that it could reach 4%. To give you an idea, AI alone will consume more electricity than the whole of Japan in the coming years. The question is, why is so much electricity needed? Well, you see, to train artificial intelligences, you need very powerful graphics cards that process a huge amount of data. Data that is not exactly cheap to store, energetically speaking. And the problem? The problem is that electricity in Europe is very expensive. And take note, because this has only gotten worse since the pandemic, and particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, the US is the world's largest oil exporter, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. In contrast, Europe has been much more dependent on Russian gas. And of course, now, with such high electricity prices, the costs for companies skyrocket. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking. Can't European companies design their AIs in Europe and train them elsewhere? The answer is yes. In fact, it's something that's already being done. The problem is that in the technological world, synergies are very, very important. Being close to each other, speaking the same language fluently, especially when it comes to adapting to changes and making quick decisions. And how important is all this to explaining the failure? Well, if it were only this, it wouldn't be so bad. But what happens is that the European Union is also lagging behind in many other fields. Electricity is not the only important factor. We also need people to program artificial intelligences. And here, apparently, there is good news for Europe. As you can see on screen, the old continent produces the same number of scientific publications as the USA. And this is without counting the UK, which is the most advanced European country in terms of artificial intelligence. What's more, in the US, the percentage of university graduates in the technology field has historically been significantly lower than in Europe. And although this is changing rapidly, in 2020, only 20% of American university graduates had their degree in the scientific technological field, compared to 36% of German graduates. However, the country that publishes the most scientific publications is China. And even today, Uncle Sam, it is still far behind. What I mean by this is that it's not only the scientific output that matters, but the ability to turn all those academic ideas into real products, assuming also that the quality of scientific research is the same in Europe and in the USA, which we cannot know very well. What we we do know is that, in this regard, Uncle Sam has a secret weapon that cannot be competed with: money. We're talking about huge amounts of funds to recruit the best specialists in the world. To give you an idea, more than 55% of all foreign PhD graduates entering the US come from the field of computer engineering. Europe and China may have great professionals, but if the US wants, all of them will end up working in an American company or university. Simply put, the salaries they can offer are much, much higher. And naturally, if you're serious about innovating in such a cutting-edge field, you need the best professionals. But these professionals are not going to be happy with a university salary of 2,000 euros a month when they can literally earn 10 times more than that in the United States. And do you want to know the worst? Even with all that we have told you, there is still another problem in Europe: the lack of customers. Think again about the companies we mentioned earlier. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta. All these companies already existed before and have jumped on the AI bandwagon, although some with more success than others. The fact is that in the US, there were already companies that were compensated for investing in artificial intelligence to improve their own services. In the end, if the Yankees have invested so much money in this sector, it's because they have dozens of gigantic companies that find this investment very profitable. Now, what companies does Europe have? Well, yes, it has large pharmaceutical companies that could benefit greatly from AI, and it also has very significant industrial companies such as Airbus and numerous car brands. But beyond that, it has no technology giants, which are precisely the ones most interested in investing. This is not something minor. In fact, this is perhaps the most relevant point. Europe is not only lagging behind the US in artificial intelligence, but in technology companies in general. This divergence has been going on for several decades, but in 2010, it exploded. Until then, the US had a slight technological advantage, yes, but its main stock index, the S&P 500, behaved practically the same as the European index. Starting in 2010, however, the US index began to grow much more rapidly. Why? Thanks in large part to its magnificent seven, the American technology giants. And why, you may ask, did none of these giants emerge in Europe? Obviously, this is a complex issue, and there are dozens of hypotheses, but think about it this way. Remember when everyone laughed at Meta for investing in NFTs and the metaverse? Today, Meta has one of the most advanced language models in the world. But to move from crypto to AI, it had to lay off 20,000 workers. Yeah, you heard correctly, 20,000 layoffs, and all within a few weeks. In any European country, such a dismissal would have taken years, and that's if it would have even been possible, because no doubt about it, it would have ended up in court. The worst thing is that Facebook is no exception. Microsoft, Google, Twitter. Since the pandemic, we have seen many layoffs in the tech sector, all paying severance payments of just a few months' salary. In Europe, on the other hand, Nokia has also had to lay off part of its workforce in order to restructure its business, but this restructuring will not be completed until 2026. Can a company really adapt to technological changes with such a rigid legal environment? And it's not just Nokia. Economist Alberto Alesina reported that in France, for example, judges routinely rule against any dismissal justified by the need to improve the company's profitability. In other words, increasing efficiency is not considered an acceptable justification for reducing employment in a company. In Italy, when it comes to protecting employees against dismissal, the notoriously slow judicial system suddenly becomes very fast and efficient, and many workers are quickly reinstated in their jobs. With such a rigid labor market, European companies simply cannot adapt to the technology sector, which is notorious for changing radically from one day to the next. But the bureaucratic problems don't end there. Many of you are probably thinking that there aren't many AI-related startups in Europe, but that's not entirely true. In fact, the number of European startups in this sector is 54 European for every 100 American ones. Yes, it's true, there is a gap, but not such a big difference that none of them has come to rub shoulders with the world leaders. What happens is simply that European startups suffer from dwarfism. They have a very difficult time growing. For what reason? Well, take a look at this graph. What you're seeing is the number of companies in France according to their size. Up to 49 workers, everything is going well. Now, as soon as companies reach the 50th worker, they simply stop growing. The reason is quite obvious. there are many regulations that only start to apply from 50 workers onwards. And so, for many companies, it doesn't pay to go from 49 to 50 workers. And obviously, if you don't pass 50 workers, you won't reach 51, 52, and so on up to 50,000. Of course, there are always loopholes to try to avoid problems, but even so, it's estimated that this phenomenon costs France 3.5 GDP points. We're talking about more than what the US spends on defense, and Uncle Sam loves missiles. As if that were not enough, European startups also have much less support, especially technology startups. And no, I'm not just referring to public support, but above all, to private support. Think about it this way. There are generally two major groups of investors in companies. On the one hand, there is private equity, which invests in mature companies. And on the other hand, the famous venture capital, which invests in startups while they're still very young. These investment funds finance small technology companies, filter out the useless ones from the ones they expect to become productive, and then help the promising ones grow by offering services such as legal advice. Well, to give you an idea, in the US, there are 6.7 venture capital firms for every 10 private equity firms. And how many do you think there are in Europe? Fewer than 2. In other words, the European financial sector leaves startup companies behind, which explains why the value of venture capital as a percentage of GDP is equivalent to 1/3 of that of the US. And what do politicians do about it? Do they facilitate venture capital investment? Well, absolutely not. It's not as if we were talking about capitalist countries here. Well, jokes aside, they don't really help. What European politicians have done, as good European politicians tend to do, is to think that the problem can be solved with state intervention, with public aid managed by civil servants who probably know the private sector as well as a baby knows a razor. The outcome? Well, judge for yourselves. Independent venture capital positively affects the growth of technology companies. Government financing options of the same style, on the other hand, don't have the slightest effect. And as if this were not enough, the US still has another great advantage over Europe. So far, we've been talking about companies, but there's another sector of the economy that also demands a lot of investment in high technology: the military sector. Half of the entire US R&D investment budget is managed by the Pentagon. The internet, GPS, cell phone batteries, many inventions that we use in our daily lives have a military origin. And let's see, in general, defense investment does not increase a country's wealth, unless it's at war, of course. But there is a certain part of public spending, which, if allocated to defensive innovation, can be much more productive than in other kinds of government-funded sideshows. But in Europe, well, let's just say that spending on military innovation is not their #1 priority.
German army simulated machine guns with brooms in NATO maneuvers.
Of course, we could name more reasons. For instance, artificial intelligences need data to train themselves, but the European Union has draconian data privacy laws that make it almost impossible to work with them in practice. What's more, if you're watching us from Europe, just think about the number of cookies you have to accept to search for anything on the internet. In recent years, there have been several advances with initiatives such as the digital single market or the pursuit of the so-called geo-blocking, but in practice, sharing data between countries is still a headache. What's more, the US invests a higher percentage of GDP in R&D, although the difference is not very large, 3.5% compared to an average of 2.25% in Europe. But of course, Europe has much higher taxes and more public spending, so its margin for investment, either by raising taxes or lowering other spending items, is quite small. However, be careful, because perhaps Europe doesn't have to ride the artificial intelligence wave. Perhaps it should focus on its strengths, such as the automotive or pharmaceutical industries, where it's obtained great successes, such as Ozempic, which is the drug of a Danish company that is used to lose weight. This drug's success has caused the country to have to publish its GDP data, removing the contribution of the pharmaceutical sector, because it completely distorts the data. But these are just two industries that are highly threatened by new technologies. On top of that, AI is not just another industry. Artificial intelligence could revolutionize practically all other industries, and Europe cannot be left behind. The question is, what are European policymakers doing to boost the sector? To be honest, I'd better not even comment.
The logic behind this strategy is that developing AI technologies by adhering to high ethical, democratic, and human rights standards will eventually provide European developers and manufacturers with a much-needed competitive advantage, with consumers and users ultimately favoring their products over those from the United States or China.
Ha! I don't believe that one. But having come this far, it's your turn. Should Europe really worry about falling behind in artificial intelligence? Are there any other reasons we haven't discussed? What do you think would be the most important reform? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.